For 15 years, the people of Valle Verde whispered about the silent man who lived at the edge of their town. They crossed the street to avoid him. They warned their children not to go near his property. They said he was hiding something dark, something dangerous. And they were right. He was hiding something. But what they found when his well ran dry wasn't what anyone expected. What emerged from that darkness would expose not just his secret, but theirs. Before we uncover what was buried beneath that Mexican valley, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever misjudged someone based on nothing but fear and rumors. Because this story will make you question everything you think you know about silence, secrets, and what people are willing to sacrifice to protect what's sacred. This is not just another story about a mysterious stranger. This is about a man who carried the weight of 500 years on his shoulders, who chose isolation over truth, who let an entire community paint him as a villain rather than expose what they weren't ready to understand. What happened in Valle Verde that summer of 2019 would force a town to confront not just their prejudices, but the very ground beneath their feet, and the history they'd been walking on without ever knowing it was there. His name was Mateo Delgado, though most people in Valle Verde simply called him the Quiet One, or that strange farmer. He arrived in the valley 15 years before. Our story begins purchasing a small, seemingly worthless plot of land on the eastern edge of town. Land that everyone knew was too rocky, too dry, too difficult to farm properly. The previous owner had abandoned it after 3 failed harvests. But Mateo paid cash, asked no questions, and moved into the crumbling adobe house without complaint. He was perhaps 50 years old then, with weathered hands, deep-set eyes that seemed to hold centuries of exhaustion, and a way of moving that suggested he was always listening to something the rest of the world couldn't hear. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his Spanish was formal, precise, laced with words that seemed to belong to another century. The townspeople noticed everything about Mateo that didn't fit. He drove an ancient truck but paid his bills on time, always in cash. His small plot produced just enough vegetables for his own consumption, yet he never seemed to struggle financially. He refused every invitation to town gatherings, church services, even the annual festival that brought the entire valley together. At night, some neighbors swore they heard strange sounds from his property. Rhythmic tapping, low humming, the scrape of metal on stone. When teenagers dared each other to peek over his fence, they reported seeing him standing motionless in his yard at midnight, staring at the ground as if he could see through it. The stories multiplied, each one darker than the last. Some said he was running from cartel, violence. Others whispered he'd committed a crime in another state. The most superstitious claimed he was practicing brujeria, witchcraft, communicating with spirits in the earth. But Mateo's only consistent companion was his well, an ancient stone structure that predated even the abandoned house, its mouth covered by a wooden lid so old the grain had turned to glass under decades of sun. Every morning and every evening, Mateo would draw water from this well with a reverence that seemed excessive for such a mundane task. He would pause before lowering the bucket, his lips moving in what might have been prayer. And sometimes, just sometimes, if you were quiet enough, you could hear him speaking down into that darkness. Not to spirits, but to something he seemed to believe was listening. The breaking point came in the form of Rafael Soto, a property developer from Mexico City who arrived in Valle Verde with plans to transform the valley into a resort destination. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no, Soto saw Mateo's land as the keystone to his development plans. Its position at the valley's entrance made it prime real estate. Within days of his arrival, Soto made Mateo an offer, triple the land's market value, immediate payment, relocation assistance. When Mateo refused without explanation, Soto doubled the offer. When Mateo refused again, simply saying, "This land is not mine to sell," Soto's confusion turned to suspicion, then to anger. "What do you mean it's not yours?" Soto demanded at their third meeting, his voice carrying across Mateo's yard to where neighbors had conveniently found reasons to linger within earshot. "The deed is in your name. You've paid taxes on it for 15 years. Are you telling me you're squatting on your own property?" But Mateo only shook his head slowly, that ancient weariness in his eyes deepening. "You wouldn't understand," he said quietly. "No one here would." And that was when Soto made his fatal mistake. He smiled. The kind of smile that holds contempt rather than humor. "Try me, old man. Or are you just another campesino who doesn't understand how business works in the modern world?" The insult landed exactly as Soto intended. Campesino. Peasant. The word dripped with the casual classism of men who measure worth in pesos and property deeds. Mateo's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a soldier's straightening, a scholar's focused attention. "I understand perfectly how business works," Mateo replied, his formal Spanish suddenly more noticeable. "But there are things older than business, Señor Soto. Things that don't appear on your development plans." This only fueled Soto's arrogance. Within a week, he'd convinced the town council to investigate Mateo's property, suggesting zoning violations, unpermitted structures, anything to force a sale. The town council was only too happy to comply. Its leader, Councilwoman Elena Vega, had nursed her own suspicions about Mateo for years. A former schoolteacher with rigid ideas about community participation and proper behavior, she'd taken Mateo's isolation as a personal affront. A man who refuses to be part of his community, she'd told anyone who would listen, is a man with something to hide. She was joined by Father Tomas, the parish priest, who resented Mateo's absence from church and interpreted his midnight vigils as evidence of paganism. And then there was Gabriela Ortiz, the local newspaper editor, who saw in Mateo's mystery the perfect story to boost her struggling publication's circulation. Together they formed an unlikely alliance, united by the certainty that they were about to expose something shameful. The inspection was scheduled for a Tuesday in late June. The summer had been brutal that year, the hottest anyone could remember. Streams that usually ran year-round had reduced to trickles. Gardens withered despite constant watering. And then, 3 days before the inspection, Mateo's well, the ancient well that had never failed in anyone's memory, ran dry. When Mateo lowered his bucket that morning and it came up empty, his reaction was so violent that his nearest neighbor, old Rosa Martinez, would later testify she heard him cry out, not in frustration, but in what sounded like grief, like someone who just lost their last living family member. Mateo disappeared into his house and didn't emerge for 2 days. When he finally came out, he looked like he'd aged a decade. He went directly to Councilwoman Vega's office, his movements urgent for the first time since anyone had known him. "You need to cancel the inspection," he told her, his voice hoarse. "Please. I'll leave. I'll sign over the land to the town, to Soto, to anyone. Just don't dig. Don't go near the well." But his desperation only confirmed Vega's suspicions. "What's down there, Mateo?" she demanded. "Drugs? Bodies? What are you so afraid?" "We'll find." Mateo closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they held something that made even Vega uncomfortable. Not fear, but a profound sadness. "Not what you think," he whispered. "Something you're not ready for. Something the world isn't ready for." It was the worst thing he could have said. By that evening, half the town knew that Mateo had tried to stop the inspection. By the next morning, everyone knew. The rumors reached fever pitch. Father Tomas began speaking about evil in their midst. Gabriela Ortiz published an editorial titled, "What Lies Beneath? The Secret Our Community Deserves to Know." And Soto, sensing victory, hired a drilling crew from the capital, men with heavy equipment who could properly investigate what was really down in that well. The tension in Valle Verde became electric. People gathered in small groups, speculating, accusing, some even calling for Mateo's immediate arrest. But Mateo himself had vanished. His truck was gone. His house was empty. Some said he'd fled back to wherever he'd come from, proof of his guilt. Others whispered darkly about what a desperate man might do to protect his secrets. The drilling crew arrived on Thursday morning, their machinery loud enough to wake the entire valley. Councilwoman Vega, Father Tomas, Soto, and half the town gathered at Mateo's property to witness the excavation. Gabriela Ortiz set up her camera equipment, already composing the exposé in her head. "Today," Vega announced to the assembled crowd, "we uncover the truth." The machinery roared to life. The drill bit into the earth beside the ancient well, digging deeper, deeper, past the water table that should have been there but wasn't. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. And then, at 40 feet, the drill bit punched through into empty space and the machinery lurched violently. The operator shut it down, confused. "There's a void down there," he said. "A big one, like a room." The silence that fell over the crowd was absolute. A big room, 40 feet beneath the earth. What followed was careful, painstaking work, widening the hole, installing supports, bringing in lighting equipment. It took 6 hours before the opening was large enough and safe enough for someone to descend. Vega volunteered immediately, perhaps sensing this was her moment of vindication. With the entire town watching via live video feed on Gabriela's screen, she descended into the darkness. What she saw when she reached the bottom would haunt her for the rest of her life. Not because it was horrifying, but because it was magnificent. The chamber was vast, easily 50 feet across, its walls covered in intricate carvings that seemed to glow in the work lights. And everywhere, on stone tables, in sealed containers, carefully organized and preserved, were objects that belonged in museums, pottery intact after centuries, codices wrapped in ancient cloth, carved jade masks, gold figurines, obsidian blades. But it wasn't just artifacts. One entire wall was covered in text, some in what looked like Nahuatl hieroglyphs, some in colonial-era Spanish, some in modern handwriting that was unmistakably Mateo's. Madre de Dios, Vega whispered, and her words carried up through the opening to the shocked crowd above. It's like a library, a museum. There are thousands of pieces down here, and writings, journals, records going back. Her voice trailed off as she approached Mateo's more recent additions, leather-bound notebooks filled with meticulous notes, photographs cross-referenced with historical documents, and a large map showing the entire valley marked with dozens of symbols. But it was the final journal, left open on a stone table as if Mateo had been interrupted mid-sentence, that made Vega's hands shake as she read aloud. They will find this place before I can complete the transfer. I have failed in my duty as guardian, as my father failed, as his father failed before him. The weight of 5 centuries falls away. And with it, the last protection. Forgive me, ancestors. Forgive me, Valley. I could not make them understand that this land was never mine. It was always yours. It was always theirs. I was only the keeper of the memory. The video feed went dead as Vega sat heavily on the chamber floor, overwhelmed. Above ground, the crowd erupted in chaos. Some demanded to know what she'd found. Others began arguing about what it meant. Soto, his face pale, backed away toward his car, suddenly understanding the magnitude of what he'd almost destroyed. Father Tomas stood frozen, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or shock. It was Gabriela who broke first, her journalist's instinct overriding everything else. She began frantically searching through Mateo's house for anything that might explain. What she found changed everything. In a locked chest under his bed, its key hanging on a nail by the door, as if he'd wanted it found, were documents that told a story spanning generations. Mateo Delgado wasn't just a farmer. He had a doctorate in archaeology from UNAM. His real name was Mateo Delgado-Cuauhtémoc, descendant of one of the last Aztec noble families. The documents traced his lineage back through 18 generations of guardians, men and women who had hidden and protected artifacts from the Spanish conquest, from looters, from corrupt officials, from anyone who would exploit or destroy them. The photographs told the rest of the story. A young Mateo in academic robes, receiving his degree. Mateo at excavation sites across Mexico, always professional, always respected. Mateo with his father, an elderly indigenous man, at this very property 30 years ago. A letter from Mexico's National Institute of Anthropology dated 20 years back, thanking Dr. Delgado for his invaluable consultation on pre-Columbian preservation techniques and expressing hope for future collaboration. And finally, heartbreakingly, a resignation letter from his university position. 15 years ago. I can no longer serve 2 masters. My duty to the academy conflicts with my duty to my ancestors. The last guardian has died, and I am called home. By evening, the truth had spread through Valle Verde like wildfire, but now the whispers carried shame instead of suspicion. Mateo hadn't been hiding crimes, he'd been hiding history. The chamber beneath his well was a carefully curated collection of artifacts that his family had protected for 500 years, rescuing pieces from destroyed temples, buying them from would-be looters, preserving them against time and greed, and the deliberate erasure of indigenous memory. The strange sounds neighbors heard at night? Mateo maintaining humidity controls, checking for damage, cataloging each piece with scholarly precision. His midnight vigils? A tradition passed down through 18 generations. A guardian's ritual of acknowledgement and protection. His refusal to participate in town life? The lonely burden of a secret. Too important to risk. Too dangerous to share. The formal Spanish that seemed archaic. The language of colonial documents he spent his nights translating, cross-referencing with Nahuatl texts to understand the full story of each artifact. But the question remained. Where was Mateo? The answer came from an unlikely source. Old Rosa Martinez, his nearest neighbor and longtime accuser. She appeared at the town square that evening, her weathered face streaked with tears. I saw him, she confessed. The night before he disappeared, he came to my door at midnight. I almost didn't open it, I was so afraid. But he looked destroyed. He said, I'm sorry for frightening you all these years. I'm sorry for the lies of silence. When they find what I've protected, will you tell them I tried? Tell them I begged them not to dig. Not because I was guilty, but because I was trying to be worthy of my ancestors' trust. I failed them. I wasn't strong enough to hold the secret alone. Rosa's voice broke. I asked him where he was going. He said, to ask the ancestors for forgiveness, and then to turn myself in to the proper authorities, not the ones who came with greed and drilling equipment, but the ones who understand that some things belong to everyone and no one. The implication was clear and devastating. Mateo had gone to the National Institute of Anthropology and History to formally report the site and surrender its guardianship. He would face legal consequences for concealing archaeological artifacts, for not reporting the site, for taking on a burden that law said belonged to the state. He would lose everything: his land, his freedom, possibly even access to the artifacts his family had protected for 18 generations. But he would ensure they were preserved, studied, shared with the world. He had chosen institutional protection over family duty, the future over the past, exposure over silence. It was, in its way, the ultimate act of sacrifice. The town of Valle Verde collapsed under the weight of its guilt. Councilwoman Vega, standing in the town square with Mateo's journals in her hands, addressed the assembled crowd with a voice hollow from crying. We called him strange. We called him dangerous. We treated him like a criminal. And all this time he was protecting something more valuable than any of us understood. He bore the loneliness of it, the fear of it, the crushing responsibility of it. And when it became too much, when the well ran dry and he knew his time was ending, he tried one more time to protect it. And we responded with drilling equipment and accusations. She paused, looking at the faces around her, seeing her own shame reflected back. He asked us to trust him. He begged us not to dig. And we called him suspicious for it. Father Tomas was next, his voice shaking with emotion. I spoke of evil dwelling among us. I suggested paganism and witchcraft. But the truth is, Mateo Delgado understood the sacred better than I ever have. He spent 15 years in prayerful guardianship of his people's memory, while I spent 15 years judging him for not praying the way I thought he should. He practiced a form of devotion, to history, to ancestors, to truth, that I failed to recognize because it didn't fit my narrow definition. The evil wasn't in his silence. It was in my rush to condemn what I didn't understand. Gabriela Ortiz, the journalist who'd been so eager to expose Mateo's secrets, stood before her camera one final time. But instead of the triumphant exposé she'd imagined, she delivered something different. I built my career on uncovering truths. But today I learned the difference between truth and reality. The truth was that Mateo Delgado was hiding something. The reality was why. I never asked why. None of us did. We saw the mystery and assumed the worst because it was easier than extending trust, easier than admitting there might be good reasons for silence, easier than considering that sometimes people carry burdens we can't see. I wanted a story. He was trying to protect history. And in my eagerness to expose him, I nearly destroyed what he'd spent his entire life preserving. But it was Soto, the developer, whose transformation was most profound. He returned to the site the next day, alone, and descended into the chamber with an archaeologist from the hastily convened government team. He spent 3 hours below ground, examining the artifacts, reading Mateo's notes, understanding the magnitude of what his resort plans would have destroyed. When he emerged, he was visibly shaken. He found Vega and handed her a document. I'm donating my development budget to create a museum here, he said quietly, and to establishing a fund in the Delgado-Cuauhtémoc name to support indigenous archaeological preservation. It won't undo what I almost did, but maybe it will honor what that man sacrificed. 3 weeks later, Mateo returned to Valle Verde. The authorities from the National Institute had cleared him of wrongdoing after reviewing his meticulous documentation and understanding the historical context of his family's guardianship. Instead of prosecution, they offered him something unexpected, the position of Director of Site Preservation, allowing him to continue protecting the artifacts, now with official support and resources. When his truck pulled into the town square, the entire population of Valle Verde was waiting. The silence was profound as Mateo stepped out, looking older, wearier, but somehow lighter, as if an impossible weight had finally been shared. Councilwoman Vega approached first, tears streaming down her face. Señor Delgado, Dr. Delgado, we owe you an apology that words cannot contain. We judged you. We accused you. We violated your trust and your peace. And all because you were different, quiet, private. We're sorry. Profoundly, unforgivably sorry. But Mateo shook his head gently, that ancient exhaustion in his eyes replaced by something softer. You did what humans do. You feared what you didn't understand. My mistake was believing I had to carry this burden alone, that I couldn't trust anyone with the truth. I let my fear of judgment create the very isolation that made you suspicious. Perhaps if I had tried just once to explain, but I was afraid. Afraid you wouldn't care, wouldn't understand, would see the artifacts as valuable only for profit. I judged you too. Father Tomas stepped forward, his voice breaking. You lived among us for 15 years, and I never once asked you about your faith, your story, your heart. I am ashamed of my role in this, Doctor. Please tell me how we can make this right. Mateo smiled, the first smile anyone in Valle Verde had ever seen from him. You can listen, he said simply. The artifacts I protected, they're not just old things. They're stories. Stories of people who lived in this valley 1,000 years before any of us. Stories of triumph and tragedy, of daily life and sacred moments, of a civilization that was brilliant and complex and flawed and human. They deserve to be heard, to be studied, to be remembered. That's all I ever wanted, for the stories to survive. What happened next would become its own legend in Valle Verde. Mateo opened his property, now officially designated as a protected archaeological site, to the entire town. Over the following months, he gave tours of the underground chamber, translating the ancient texts, explaining the significance of each artifact, sharing the stories his ancestors had passed down alongside the objects themselves. Children who had been warned to stay away from the strange farmer now sat at his feet, listening to tales of jaguar warriors and corn goddesses. Teenagers who had dared each other to spy on him now volunteered as assistant catalogers, learning proper preservation techniques. Adults who had whispered about his midnight rituals now attended his evening lectures, understanding that those solitary vigils had been a scholar's dedication, not a madman's obsession. The museum that Soto's money helped build became one of the most visited archaeological sites in central Mexico. But its power lay not in the artifacts themselves, remarkable as they were, but in the story of how they'd been preserved. 18 generations of guardians who had chosen protection over profit, silence over fame, sacrifice over ease. Mateo's journals were published, becoming required reading in Mexican universities, a case study in indigenous resistance, cultural preservation, and the ethics of archaeological stewardship. And Mateo himself, no longer silent, no longer isolated, became a bridge between past and present, a living example of how individual dedication can preserve what institutional systems fail to protect. Valle Verde transformed too. The town that had prided itself on its tight-knit community realized they'd excluded their most valuable member. They established a community council on cultural preservation. They began documenting their own histories, interviewing elders, preserving traditions they'd taken for granted. They learned to ask questions before making assumptions, to extend trust before demanding explanations, to consider that silence might protect rather than conceal. The children of Valle Verde grew up understanding that their valley was built on layers of history, that the ground beneath their feet held stories worth protecting, and that the quiet people among them might be carrying burdens worthy of respect rather than suspicion. Years later, when researchers from around the world came to study the Valle Verde collection, they marveled not just at the artifacts, but at the preservation technique that had kept them pristine for centuries. Mateo's answer was always the same. My ancestors understood something that modern archaeology is only beginning to appreciate. That preservation is not about removing objects from their context and putting them in controlled environments. It's about understanding why they mattered to the people who made them and honoring that meaning in how we care for them. The chamber wasn't just storage. It was a continuation of the sacred relationship our people had with these objects. I didn't guard artifacts. I guarded memory, connection, identity. That's why I couldn't leave, couldn't sell, couldn't explain, because the moment they became archaeological resources instead of ancestors, treasures, something essential would be lost. The lesson of Valle Verde spread far beyond one small town in Mexico. It became a parable in anthropology departments about the ethics of cultural ownership. It appeared in sermons about judging others and the many forms devotion can take. It became a case study in journalism schools about the responsibility to investigate fully before publishing accusations. Parents told their children the story of Dr. Mateo Delgado-Cuauhtémoc, the guardian who bore suspicion and loneliness for 15 years rather than betray a trust 500 years old. And in Valle Verde itself, at the entrance to the museum, a plaque bore words from Mateo's final journal entry, written the night before his well ran dry and his secret was exposed. To guard the past is to protect the future. To preserve memory is to ensure identity. To carry this burden alone is my choice, my honor, and my grief. But if this secret is found, if these artifacts are revealed, may whoever discovers them understand. I did not hide these treasures from the world. I hid them for the world, until the world was ready to receive them with the reverence they deserve. The story of the quiet farmer became more than local legend. It became a reminder that the people we dismiss, the neighbors we fear, the strangers we judge, might be protecting something sacred, carrying something profound, or bearing burdens we cannot see. That silence is not always secrecy. That isolation is not always suspicion. And that the most extraordinary acts of devotion often look like ordinary life to those who don't know the full story. Mateo taught Valle Verde, and through them the world, that true strength is not in loud declarations but in quiet consistency, that real faith is measured not in public displays but in private dedication, and that the highest form of love is protecting what others don't yet understand they need. So the next time you encounter someone who seems strange, distant, or inexplicably private, pause before you judge. Ask yourself, what might they be protecting? What burden might they carry? What sacred trust might they be honoring in the only way they know how? Because beneath the surface of every life, there are chambers filled with stories, artifacts of experience, treasures of wisdom that won't be revealed until the time is right. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give another person is not demanding they excavate those depths before they're ready, but trusting that their silence might be protecting something more valuable than our curiosity deserves to uncover. If this story moved you, if it made you reconsider someone in your own life, if it reminded you that judgment is easy but understanding requires courage, share this video. Leave a comment about a time you misjudged someone or were misjudged yourself. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that challenge how we see the world and each other. Because these stories matter. These lessons endure, and sometimes the most important truths are the ones we almost destroy in our rush to expose them.